Hello and welcome back to Mideast in Depth. The editorial board in the New York Times states that speaking at the United Nations on Monday, President Obama and President Vladimir Putin affirmed the need for international cooperation. However, the editorial points out, beyond that, their two visions are radically at odds, and each used his speech to blame the other for the catastrophic war and the refugee crisis it has unleashed. It reveals Mr. Putin said it was an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces, who are valiantly fighting terrorism face to face, conveniently ignoring the fact that Mr. Assad's main target has always been his domestic opposition, not the Islamic State. It continues, Mr. Obama argued that in 2011, Mr. Assad reacted to peaceful protests by escalating repression and killing that, in turn, created the environment for the current strife, which the Islamic State has been able to exploit. It adds that despite this being Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin's first formal meeting in over 2 years, there was no indication of progress. Their personal antipathy was clear in their speeches when they took jabs at each other, with pointed language over Ukraine, Iraq and democracy, as well as Syria. It adds, Mr. Putin enabled the Assad government early on, and he has no particular strategy to contain the Syrian conflict. With Russia grappling with sanctions, lower oil prices and a weakened economy, it is unclear how much he can afford to invest in a dead-end war in Syria. On a final note, the editorial recalls, in the meantime, millions of Syrians have been killed, maimed or forced to flee to Europe, and countries of the region are being further destabilized by the endless violence. Kadri Gürsel asks in Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse whether Turkey's rules of engagement against Syrian planes will now apply to Russian planes flying near Turkish borders. He writes, Turkey's July decision to finally open its air bases near Syria and Iraq, including in Sirleq, to the US-led coalition fighting the Islamic State was a game-changer for the region. It meant the coalition's air raids against IS would become more effective and less costly. Now Gürsel asks, will Ankara stick to its rules of engagement if airplanes approaching the border have the Russian star on their wings? The writer highlights, the United States is quite content with Ankara's decision to open the bases. Turkey is said to have engaged in more serious cooperation against IS since the spring. Also, US support for the PYD is said to be limited to the fight against IS, not involving the supply of weapons and ammunition. He points out Turkey's #1 problem and priority today is the PKK, which it has been fighting since the 2-year ceasefire came to an end in July. Yet for the United States, the PKK's Syrian extension, the PYD, is not part of the problem, but part of the solution. Overthrowing Assad has ceased to be a US priority since IS emerged as a threat on a regional scale. He concludes, with Russia's military moves balancing the gains that other jihadi groups made in Idlib in the north and Daraa in the south earlier this year, Ankara's priority of toppling Assad has grown even more irrelevant. Ultimately, the Russian move means Ankara will have to settle for much less than it had hoped for by letting the anti-IS coalition use its air bases. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. And subscribe to Mideast in Depth on iTunes. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.